Demonetization, at its basic description, is really the act of stripping a currency unit of its status as legal tender. Every note you have in your wallet has legal tender. The note you have today really has the name of the legal name of the Republic of Kenya. So if you go to the restaurant outside, the reason that waitress will pick that currency is because it's backed by the law. So when the government goes ahead and does what is called demonetize, essentially what is happening is it's stripping away the status of that legal tender. On Madaraka Day last year, it was announced that demonetization would be taking place. There were actually two announcements that were rolled into one. The first announcement was there would be a change of currency. We'd be moving from one currency regime to another currency regime. That was the first announcement, meaning we'd get new 200 shilling notes, new 500 shilling notes, and such. That was not a big thing because we had already anticipated that, especially when we passed the Constitution in 2010. Part of it contemplated that within a few years, we would move to a new currency regime. And that's very common. That happens in many jurisdictions across the world. It happens in the EU at the turn of the century, or should I say at the turn of the millennium. They moved, about 27 countries moved to one currency. So that was not a big deal because you're really moving from one currency regime to another currency regime. But the second more potent announcement was that the 1,000 shilling note would cease to have status in itself. And that was a powerful one. Because remember, for the lower notes, the 200 shilling notes, the 500 shilling notes, it was essentially you were exchanging one old 200 note for a new 200 note. So even if today if you went to an old jacket and found your 200 shilling note, could still take it and it can be exchanged. What was more powerful was the 1,000 shilling note was given a time frame of existence, and that was from, I think it was Madaraka Day until end of September, about 4 months. So what that meant was at the end of that 4 months, that 1,000 shilling note would really become a piece of paper with no value whatsoever. So what were the stated objectives? It's good to be very clear. And here I got the quote from the central bank, where he said, "We have assessed the grave concerns that our large banknotes, particularly the older 1,000 shilling series, are being used for illicit financial flows in Kenya and also in other countries in the region." So fighting illicit flows was, we would confidently say, was a primary objective of demonetization. At that time, it felt that part of the reason that money wasn't moving around was there was a suspicion that there was a lot of illicit financial flows. There was some suspicion that there are few individuals who are holding cash in their bedrooms, in their houses, and that was one of the reasons that was put out there. And the thinking that was put at that time was, if we can remove the legal status out of those notes, we will start seeing money moving, money circulating. I was a bit curious because there were interesting debates that were coming up. I think one of the most profound debates was that mega corruption, which the CBK was trying to fight, takes place in US dollars. So the objective of demonetizing the economy, it might not really touch those people because there's that feeling that mega corruption takes place along corridors, global corridors, where the currency of preference is the United States dollar, which is the global reserve currency. So anytime you try to demonetize, you might really be missing the point because those actors are in a sense, on a whole different level, transacting on a whole different currency, and they'll just bypass this whole thing. There was that powerful argument, which to a certain extent I agreed to. In that sense, that was one of the powerful arguments that came. But nevertheless, the decision was made that demonetization would take place, and the reasonable time of 4 months was given. I think 4 months was a reasonable time. So that was the objective, to fight illicit financial flows. My argument at that time of demonetization was, if we are going to take the 1,000 shilling note out of circulation, we need to replace it with an equivalent amount. But it seems that did not quite happen, because we saw 60 billion moving out of. Now 60 billion is not mean change. In fact, when you talk to many businesses, which we do, part of our mandate is really to talk to ordinary businesses, they'll tell you 2019 was a tough year, but the second half of 2019 was especially tough, because that is when almost money stopped circulating. To a sense, you find a lot of people, they have the gut feeling that something strange happened in the second half of 2019, but many of them, maybe they don't have the economic tools or the languages to describe it, but this is it. Cash in circulation dropped to 2014, and we are seeing it happening right now. We are seeing, for the first time in Kenya, land rates, we are seeing land prices are coming down. We saw that slow down in businesses. A lot of businesses in 2019 were issuing profit warnings. So many companies were laying off people. There are two main avenues that money enters an economy. The first avenue is through the treasury spending, through projects, building roads, building schools, building bridges, building dams. That's one way. The second way is through banks lending to entrepreneurs to do that. So those are the two main avenues. So you could see the private sector avenue was closed down because of the interest rate cap, and also the public avenue was also starting to close down because of the slowdown in movement from the treasury. So all of a sudden we were caught in between a rock and a tough place at that time. When 2019 was coming in, really it had been on the back of these big events, to the point where the idea was very, very noble, but we were sitting in an economy that it's almost anemic. I keep saying money in an economy can be an analogy to blood in a human being. And blood circulates across a human body, and that's how money should circulate in an economy. But when you have too little blood in a human being, if you find a human being who's hemorrhaging so much and losing blood, they become anemic. And I was starting to feel like the Kenyan economy was starting to become anemic because of cash. When the demonetization, with its very good noble ideals, when it came in, it hit another blow to the economy, to the point where for many people, if you talk to people who've been in business for the last 10 years, they'd say maybe they have never seen a year like 2019, because it was almost, cash was at a record low level. And even if you think of the companies that were announcing job cuts, these are big companies in very growth sectors. Telcom announced cuttings, Stanbic Bank, Portland Cement at some point almost fired everybody. EABL also announced some job cuts. So, and when you think about the Kenyan economy, if you look at the stock exchange, the sectors that do extremely well, the sectors that hold the country, is normally telcos, banks, and EABL is fast-moving consumer goods. So when these top cream companies start announcing job cuts, it shows you that we are not where we should be, because these are the companies even foreigners want to have shareholding in, and that. So for me, that has been the road, the macroeconomic. When we talk about cash in circulation, that has been the road that we've journeyed the last 5 years. What are the options that we have to restore a vibrant economic growth? And for me, it goes back to the beginning. I think we have to remonetize the economy. We have to restore the liquidity levels that have been there for the last 5 years. Because as we say, right now, we are where we are in 2014. You can imagine that's 6 years. You can imagine the population growth. I think we were told earlier that our population went up by 10 million in the last 10 years. So you can imagine the population growth between 2014 to 2020. That's a huge population growth that needs to transact, but the money is really behind it. So for me, what I had argued, even before the demonetization, I wrote an opinion piece saying, after demonetization, we have to remonetize. And what is remonetizing the economy? It's really injecting liquidity into the economy using both indirect and direct techniques. And I'll talk about the two. I'll talk about the indirect techniques, and I'll talk about the more aggressive direct techniques. What are some of the indirect techniques? Number one is lowering of the benchmark interest rates. Those are the tools for anybody who's done Economics 101. You'll be told when the economy needs more money, the central bank lowers its benchmark interest rates, banks follow and lower the interest rates, and we get more liquidity into the economy. Because, for example, if I was paying a monthly installment, if I had a loan and I was paying 20,000 shillings and the central bank lowers the benchmark interest rates, I expect my bank to follow due and to reduce my interest rate so that if I was paying 20,000 shillings, maybe I'll be paying 17,000 shillings. And that 3,000 shillings now is money that I can use for other activities. That is how typically that's how interest rates work. When you want to reduce a liquidity, you increase interest rates. When the economy is very tight, you reduce to allow the levels of liquidity. So it's Economics 101. But for some reason, it doesn't seem to be working in Kenya. And this is something economists need to reflect on. I think within the economic circles, we really have to start asking the lowering of the benchmark rates, what impact does it have on the real economy? Because remember in November, the central bank lowered its benchmark rate by about 0.5%. 2 months later, only one bank had lowered its benchmark, its interest rate. So for me, I think this is one of the big discussion points. How effective is the transmission rate of the central bank to commercial banks? I think that's it's something economists have written papers on in economic circles, but now it's coming to the mainstream and people want to know, is there a strong mechanism? Because as it turns out, banks are not reducing. So is there any mechanism that can connect the benchmark rate? So when the governor says we are slashing down rates, all the 42 banks that are lending, in the next day on the newspapers, they announce that loans have gone down by a subsequent. Right now, there's really no very strong mechanism. That the transmission signal is very weak, or to my point, almost non-existent. And for me, that's a major concern. Indirect techniques is, you can attract foreign direct investment into a country. We've seen the president going to the US, going to Asia, to China, closing deals. And in a way, that is how you attract. You talk to investors. We've seen Pakistan community here in Nairobi. We saw the Qataris. And it's a very good way because investment is a big part of the economy. But the problem with foreign direct investment is it's hard to predict. Yes, you'll have Qataris coming to Kenya. Yes, you'll partner them with similar businesses in Kenya. But it takes time before a foreigner understands Kenya, wants to invest in Kenya. It can easily take 1, 2, 3 years. Are we ready to wait for that? Can that solve the problem? So those are what I call indirect techniques, because it's good money. The problem with FDI money, it's also, it not only does it take long, but it's also not enough to meet the challenges we have as a country. Because if one stroke took out 60 billion, I can't think of any investor who's going to bring 60 billion to the table today, saying I'm putting up a 60 billion plant. It's very hard. And even if they do, that money won't come today. It'll probably be tranched in the next 10 years and stuff. So those are the indirect techniques which economics provides, but the problem is they are dependent on other things. They make certain assumptions which are sometimes not necessarily true. Then we have what is called really the direct techniques. This is where you inject liquidity directly into the economy. Sometimes people get cautious about this because they say, inflation will go up, our currency will devalue. But there are instances where, we've seen direct interventions coming up. If you remember, after the post-election violence of 2008, at that time, I think the economic growth had gone to its lowest point in that decade. It had gone down to about 2%. And at that time, the deputy prime minister at that time, Uhuru Kenyatta at that time, was the Minister of Finance and the deputy prime minister. And he launched a major stimulus package at that time. And it was really meant to really fixing markets, roads constructions, really ensuring that, food from the farms are really reaching the markets in an accessible way, lighting up streetways. And we saw the economy going from 2.8% to possibly what is the largest growth we've had since the decade. Since the 2000s, it went to almost 8%. So it shows you how stimulus incentives do. And this was and we didn't see inflation. In fact, if you look at inflation numbers for that year, there was no major blip because it was very targeted. It was going to areas that were affected by those ethnic violence, fixing those roads. So we never saw inflation going up. And for me, that was a classic example of direct interventions of what a stimulus package can do. We saw more money coming in, and next year we saw economic growth went up to almost 8%, almost 4 times what it was. We also have what the Americans attempted, what is called quantitative easing. You remember after the financial crisis of 2008, the world was almost facing a recession. In fact, in some countries, it was in a recession. And the two schools of thought that came up at that time was, how do countries come out of recessions? And for us as economists, it was quite exciting because for the first time we could see the policies, live and direct. And we could say, these are the policies at work. These are not just textbook policies, and these are the policies that don't work. At that time, the Europeans went with austerity measures. What Kenya is trying to do right now, they really reduced their spending, and they had a very difficult time with that policy, because if you look at a place like Greece, almost 20% of the GDP, were contracted. It was a very painful experience. But the Americans, they said, we are not going to go that direction. We're going to go the stimulus way. We're going to go through the quantitative easing, where they really created new money and they pumped it into the system. They bought government bonds. They bought all of the treasury bills. And we saw the American economy really thriving. It really came out of that tough period much faster and in a better shape than the European compatriots, up to the point even the Europeans copied it, and the Europeans applied their own quantitative easing. Japan applied its own quantitative easing. And for me, that's an example of, that is how sometimes when the liquidity levels are very low, even China, after the coronavirus really affected it, we saw last 2 weeks ago, they injected new money, almost $17 billion, just to keep the economy moving, because nobody's moving in China. There's no trade, there's no tourism, nothing is happening. So there was a direct intervention. I feel our policy makers should start looking at these direct techniques, because if you are going to wait for the lowering of the benchmark rates by the CBK, I think we might wait a very long time. If you're going to wait for foreign direct investment, we might wait for a very long time. Yet the country has urgent needs. So I think it's a question of how do we deploy both indirect techniques and direct techniques to remonetize the economy. At that time, the Federal Reserve chairman in the US was Ben Bernanke. And when he proposed quantitative easing, he faced a lot of opposition, because a lot of people are saying this will generate inflation, the macro variables would go out of place. But in his book, if somebody cares to read his book, it's called The Courage to Act. He felt these are the bold moves that really sustain a country. And he went ahead and did it, and America today is better off because of the measures he put in place. So I think as we look at the Kenyan economy, both short-term, medium-term, and long-term, I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, the biggest employer of the biggest job creator in this market is really entrepreneurs. And when you talk about the factors of production in an economy, there are only 4 factors of production in an economy. It's land, capital, labor, and really the entrepreneur who deploys those 3 to create jobs. How do we get more money in the hands of entrepreneurs? Because the private sector has a much better track record of creating jobs than the government. In fact, every time I hear political parties saying in their manifestos we'll create 1 million jobs, sometimes I cringe, because for me, government really should not be the source of creating jobs. Government should create enabling environments in which private sectors and entrepreneurs who have a much better track record in creating jobs would thrive. So for me, that has to be the new thinking. How do we get more money in the hands of entrepreneurs? How do we sort out the unemployment issue we have in Kenya? Because our unemployment levels are reaching unsustainable levels, yet we are still not addressing that. That has to be the conversation moving forward. There's a big thinking on the economic direction that Kenya is going, and there are many conversations taking place. Whether it's issues of, and some of them are covered in the BBI, some of them are not. But for me, I think as sober economists, we have to ask ourselves, what is the status of the 4 factors of production? What is the status of land use in Kenya? What is the status of capital? And capital, this is now remonetizing the economy. What's the status of labor? What's the question about labor? And what's the status of the entrepreneur? Is the entrepreneur in Kenya thriving, or is he collapsing? Many people are going out of businesses because the environment is really not thriving for them. On the land part, I think we'll talk about that. It's in the tax part. When you talk about capital, it's really I've addressed it. When you talk about unemployment, it's really, I think that's one of the hottest topics that the government has to address, because yes, we have a young population, but it can be a demographic dividend or a demographic time bomb if you really don't think about it. If we can create jobs for these young people, and that can only happen when entrepreneurs have money to build businesses that can hire these young people. I think that's the longer term considerations that we have to look at.